Hi, so this is our second episode with the Belter Pod. My name is Maggie, and I'm the founder of Belter Pouches. And with me today is Dr. Hulton, and he is a senior lecturer in sports and exercise science at the University of Surrey. He has a PhD in sports, nutrition, exercise, and exercise metabolism, and is currently researching pre-exercise nutrition and team sports. How are you?
Good, thanks, Maggie. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Absolutely. So tell me how you got into this industry and what really sparked you, I guess, chasing after your PhD in sports nutrition and exercise metabolism and what you're doing now with research. And I know you're working with two schools right now in the United States, so please just tell me all about it.
Yeah, so I suppose I got into this just being a kid who just loved sports, to play every sport, go in, really sort of got in more to soccer. Didn't really know what I wanted to do with myself. Sort of interested, like I said, in sport, in science, so sports science seemed the obvious choice. So I just followed that to university, yeah. And then opportunity came to sort of do research as undergrad. And that's where I sort of started that sort of pre-exercise nutrition interest. Just looking at different drinks, sort of like adding, the carbohydrate and things like that. And then I've developed them. I worked in the labs within the university, then got the opportunity to do a PhD. What I wanted to do with a PhD with my research, I wanted it to be very sort of ecological. And what I mean by that, I wanted it to I wanted practitioners to take it and be able to implement it in their practice, rather than being so really driven in a controlled lab environment. I wanted it to be real. So that's where the pre-exercise, sorry?
So of course, experience.
Yeah, exactly. So started doing some of the pre-exercise nutrition, looking at sort of high carbohydrate meals, different types of carbohydrates, glycemic indexed. Then we started looking at high fat meals. And then what we started to do, and this was all around soccer in terms of providing a proper meal, proper time scale before we start the exercise. And then after looking at the meals, then we thought, okay, what happens if we start to add a little caffeine? And that's where caffeine first came into my interest, into my research, really. And it showed that actually having caffeine prior to exercise, it reduced our RP, our rate and perceived exertion. So we felt, or the participants felt, that they weren't exercising as hard compared to when they didn't have it. And also, it enabled them to do a little bit more exercise at the end. So where we did some sort of soccer simulation, we then did like a capacity test to see sort of how much is left in the tank, so to speak. And then they improved that sort of endurance there. So I was on my background in PhD, and I've always sort of maintained this interest in sport and performance more than anything, really. And that's why I sort of kept the idea of caffeine, because for me, I like coffee. It makes sense. You have a bit of caffeine, it gives you a bit of a perk. So I wanted to delve a little bit deeper there. And then since my PhD, I moved to the University of Surrey, and I work there more on the teaching side of things. But obviously, I love the research, and I want to keep my hand in, and also want to be able to teach and be able to sort of talk on my research. So that's why I really sort of engaged in that. And yeah, it's progressed a little bit now. I work with the undergrads and sort of concentrating on caffeine projects. I've had a couple in the past looking at sort of strength endurance and maximum strength with trained female athletes. And we found that there is an increase in strength endurance with the caffeine. But also what was interesting there was no difference between having like a moderate dose versus a higher dose. And then that got me thinking about, okay, what happens if we have even lower doses? Because we know some people can really respond to caffeine and get a little bit more anxious and get the jitters and things.
It's funny because when joining Belter, I know you're looking into the product, but we'll tackle that in a little bit. It's so funny because at first, when I was first introduced to caffeine, I'm thinking I have to have a higher dosage for it to work. And then I slowly learned that through working with Belter, that's not fully the case. And so I feel like there's a, misconception of caffeine and how high doses actually, you don't need to have 400 milligrams a day for it to work and for you to function, because I was always, I do get jittery with coffees. I do love coffee, but I do get the stomach aches. So that's where, for me, I think it's super interesting that you can take caffeine in different ways. And so I find that so interesting that I knew nothing about caffeine until introduced to Belter. So I find your research very, very interesting.
Yeah, the dose is interesting, and it goes for a lot of sort of nutritional products, really. Everyone thinks more is better, but you actually find it's like a nice sort of inverted U function in terms of we have a little bit, we start to improve, and then we peak at a certain level. But if we have more and more, we're going to drop down because the side effects will be more pronounced. And the thought process was, so in the 90s when the research really exploded after initial explosion in the 70s, people were looking to do more and more. But they were getting to this point where when you have above 6 milligrams per kilogram body mass, it doesn't really add to the improvement. Obviously, it increases in terms of the concentration in the body, but it doesn't sort of translate to performance. So the idea now, the thought process is that 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram body weight is the good sort of optimal dose. But then more and more people and more and more research has looked at lower doses. So we're now seeing a bit of a shift actually to say, actually a lot lower. And there was one research review from some guys in Australia from actually even as low as sort of 0.9 to around 2 milligrams per kilogram body mass can still have a really pronounced improvement in performance. So yeah, it's really interesting of how much I have to take. And you're right. People think they need to take loads and going up to 400, but actually it doesn't really make. It doesn't. You don't need to go that high.
Energy drinks being at 200, and it's actually 2 servings for a monster that is this big. So you sit there going, "Oh, I'm drinking way more than I feel like I should be." But yeah. I always find it. So with caffeine specifically, does it actually boost energy or focus or both?
Well, I suppose the main way caffeine works is the really good thing about caffeine. I suppose it's got different functions, different sort of mechanisms having an effect. Originally, people were thinking that we have caffeine, it enhances our ability to burn out fat and use our fat stores for energy. Now, that's good on one hand because we've got a limited supply of our other energy sources, which is our muscle glycogen from a carbohydrate, and we're very limited in terms of how much we store for that. So if we can burn more fats, we can save that other source of energy. So then later on exercise, when we may be starting to get fatigued or others are not being able to maintain their levels, we've got that energy in reserve to sort of kick in, really. So that was the original source. And that's sort of still true to a certain extent. But there's been a lot more research where our glycogen has not been a limiting factor. So it must be something else sort of in the background working away. So now the primary reason probably is caffeine working as an adenosine antagonist. So caffeine and adenosine share a similar structure. And throughout the day, we have a buildup of adenosine because it's a byproduct of metabolism and things. So by the end of the day, these levels are keeping going up and up and up. And that's why at night you feel a bit tired. So if caffeine shares a similar structure, the caffeine will jump on the receptors where adenosine will normally bind and it'll block it. So that's that sort of antagonism, if you like. And by doing that, it sort of has the opposite effect and makes us a little bit more, gives us a bit of a boost and things. Mm-hmm. So that will sort of prevent that drowsiness and things like that. So that's probably the primary reason. And then there's other sort of thought processes or other functions, if you like. So other sort of stimulating our central nervous system. Mm-hmm. So again, that's having a bit of a increase in attention, reaction time, cognitive function, and that type of thing. And we've got other factors linked to the release of neurotransmitters, things like dopamine and epinephrine. So again, things are going to have that boost. And then it also can affect our muscles in a positive way. Just of caffeine can increase our ability to recruit more muscle fibers and increase the contraction as well. So it has a lot of different aspects, and that's why caffeine's really good in sort of a lot of different sports, as well as just in, if you're tired and you want a bit of a boost, if you've got a long drive, or if you've had a hard day the day before or whatever.
So let's say that we have the long drive, we have the sports, we have going to the gym. So I've heard 1,000 different answers to this. So I'm hoping that you give me the answer that I need. When's the best time for someone to take caffeine before they do an activity such as, work, gym, etc.? I've heard, is it just how you literally take it? So if it's in pill form, you take it when it tells you on the bottle. Is it coffee because it's an hour? Is there a right answer to really when taking caffeine helps you the most during your activities?
I suppose it depends on how you take it. So if you take it as a food or a drink, then you want to be taking it probably around 45 minutes beforehand. So that's probably when you're going to see that peak of caffeine within the system. So it's going to take time for it to get into the stomach and for it to get sort of digested and absorbed and get into the system. Around 45 minutes on a food or a drink. If you're taking it like a gum or like a belt or pouch, then the research with some of the gum is sort of showing that we get a peak a lot earlier because it's not going to the stomach, it's getting absorbed through the mouth. Mm-hmm. the peak was occurring around sort of 15 to 20 minutes. So that's when you're going to probably feel the full force. And caffeine's interesting as well because it's got a long half-life. So what that means is half of the response is going to wear off at a certain time, and the half-life is around 4 to 6 hours. But that can fluctuate quite a lot depending on individual differences in sort of genes and things like that.
Okay. So when it comes to, now I've asked you about time, but how much caffeine is considered too much caffeine? Because I've also heard different answers on that one. Does it have to do with our weight? Is there a difference between women and men?
In terms of how much, it's probably easier to think of it relative to body weight. And that's when I said earlier about the 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram body mass. So that is sort of the optimal range. It's difficult to say how much is too much because research has gone a lot more than that. And it's still so up to sort of 9 and even 10 milligrams per kilogram body mass. I wouldn't advise that. I don't think of any additional boost. So I would say just go up to 6 and that's enough. So if you think of what's that? Probably between 300 and 400 milligrams. If you're having a big sort of dose of it, that would probably be for one dose for your average person, I'd say. And in terms of women and men or males and females, it's a really good question. And it's such a shame. Like within sports science, that females have had a bit of a raw deal because a lot of research has sort of tackled differences to females. One of the reasons because the menstrual cycles, everyone's scared of what's going on in the cycle and a bit unsure. And the last sort of maybe 10, 15 years, more people now are trying to focus on it. And you do get differences, especially in glucose metabolism within different stages of the cycle. Caffeine is actually shown depending on contraception. So if you're on a contraception, it can increase the half-life of caffeine and slow down the metabolism. So that is something that potentially could act in your favor if you're taking some form of contraception. Then caffeine may stay a little bit more elevated in the system. But it's still a little bit of an unknown. That's why some of my previous research, we looked at sort of trained females who were, had a history of working in the gym. And we did show that even a low dose or a moderate dose of 3 milligrams per kilogram body mass had a positive effect on strength endurance.
So to kind of lean into Belter, how does Belter's caffeine pouch compare to a standard cup of coffee, energy drink in terms of absorption and effect? So
sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Question.
So in terms of the dose, the dose is comparable to others. Probably maybe, if you think about low dose caffeine, it fits within that bracket straight away. So that's really good. And the other good thing about having a low dose, it gives you an opportunity to take another one a little bit later. If you think of within exercise, if you're doing a long bout of steady state exercise on a bike or going for a run, you could take one at the 15 minutes beforehand, and then another one when you start to get tired, or maybe at the halfway point or something, or strategically think of when you're going to take them through the course of a day, a long duration based activity, or even like within team sports, potentially to take one at half time to have a bit of a boost for that second half, because we know especially things like sprinting and high speed running are going to really drop off in that second half, and that's even with our elite athletes. So we know we've got to maintain a consistent sort of level. So having a small dose maybe at the beginning, another one at half time, especially within that window of half time, because it's 15 minutes, which would fit quite nicely with how we think that the caffeine is going to get into the system within that 15 or 20 minute window. So we get that peak then when we step back out on the pitch.
So I've talked about times, when to take it, but how late is too late for caffeine? Because I know most people have heard the whole, I can't take caffeine after 5 p.m. because I won't be able to sleep. But I don't know if that's fully true. Because I mean, personal experience, I can do 5 o'clock and I'll be fine by 9. But I've also heard the 4-hour window for caffeine. So I'm curious on what your take is on actual time to stop taking caffeine for those trying to sleep, let's say at 10 p.m.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think it's very individual because, again, you're going to have some variation in different people's genotypes. Some people are quite fast at metabolizing the caffeine, other people are slower. So it might have more of an effect on them if they take it too late because it's going to stay within their system for longer. There is some research that sort of says even before 5 o'clock we should stop caffeine. But as long as you don't have too much, and if you may be more habituated to caffeine, I think it's more case by case rather than saying everyone should not have it at a certain time. I think it depends on, Yeah, I think so. I think it needs to be a little bit, because everyone's individual, and everyone takes this on differently. Because some people, yeah, like I said, fast responders, slow responders. Some people get more anxious with caffeine. So yeah, it's case by case, I would probably say.
It's been really interesting on my own journey with caffeine, especially again joining Belter, but it's really interesting to see what caffeine levels give me anxiety. So like a cup of coffee, I feel is almost close to Belter's level. We're at 96, but I get more anxious on coffee than I do with the pouches. Is there any research behind like just format of caffeine that helps with anxiety?
No, not that I know of. Again, it's a really, really good question, actually.
I did this to Dr. Green and Dr. Killen yesterday. So I was throwing them. They're like, we actually added that to research. And they go, great, let me know. Would love to be a guinea pig. But I'm always curious about my own personal use, because I do get anxiety off coffee versus just pouch doesn't do anything for me. It just kind of levels me out. So it's just out of curiosity.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of with habituation as well. So a lot of studies would say, okay, you need to know how people are habituated with caffeine in terms of, is it going to affect someone who doesn't take caffeine, and then you give them something, then bang, you have a big effect. There's someone who has it a lot, and won't have an effect. But actually, there's some research now come out that's sort of conflicting with that. So saying actually, it doesn't matter if you have it, if you have a dose, you should still get an effect, even though you have it quite a lot, so it should still have that type of effect for us. So yeah, again, it's really interesting.
So, as an avid caffeine user, are there any kind of long-term effects when it comes to everyday use? Is there like positive versus negative? Is it a case-by-case situation again, or is there when it comes to athletes, especially because I know a lot of them will use it pretty much daily to get through their day, practices, school, etc.
Yeah. So no, not really. Well, not within the sporting concept. Nothing that I've seen there, because today now we've got students working in clubs in the UK with Premiership soccer teams, and I was chatting to them there, and they take caffeine for performance aspects there, and they don't really see any negative side effects in terms of it affecting health. Previously, people have mentioned about caffeine and linked to cramping because of dehydration and things, but there's more evidence now sort of suggesting that that's more of a myth in terms of dehydration. And as long as you just consume your regular hydration and drink sensibly, it shouldn't be an issue really. So within the sporting context, it shouldn't be, as long as it's taken sensibly and people are not going too crazy and having too much of it really.
So that actually leads me into my next question. What is the biggest myth of caffeine that you've discovered?
I was chatting to someone recently actually, and there's this thing saying about, there's a bit of a trend saying that we should not have caffeine first in the morning because it affects the crash, and that's linked to sort of cortisol. So when you have caffeine, you kind of get a little bit of an increase in cortisol, and cortisol is more of a stress hormone. So we don't really want too much cortisol. But there's no real sort of robust study that really look into that. And then the other point is, when we exercise, we get an increase in cortisol. And exercise at all. So I think that's about having this, it's late when we have it. I think if it helps you, have coffee in the morning, that'll be fine with me.
Interesting. So does caffeine actually raise your blood pressure?
Yeah, there has been some studies that have shown a side effect is an increase in blood pressure and heart rate. So it can do that. But again, I don't think it's more of a chronic thing. It could be just acutely having that increase. Again, I haven't really looked at the research to see if they follow people more chronically and is it a continual increase in blood pressure.
Okay. So back to Belter, when it comes to a physiological standpoint, what's the real difference between Belter and energy drinks?
I suppose the speed of absorption is something that is really interesting in terms of you got that have the Belter pouch get into the system quicker. Plus you haven't got, especially when you're exercising, if you're going to take a big energy drink, you've got that volume of fluid that's going to be sitting in your stomach. So that can be uncomfortable. A lot of people get some sort of GI distress with that. So that can be sort of a negative of having a big sort of bolus of fluid. So I suppose the positive of the belt that is potentially the speed of contraction to get us that increase quicker, having no GI distress and things like that. I suppose sometimes you don't want an energy drink because you don't want any additional calories either. So it's a positive there in terms of you just want the caffeine. It just gives you caffeine, it doesn't give you anything else.
So what should people look for when it comes to caffeine products? When reading, I know a lot of people are, especially in the US, we're reading the back of labels. So what should people be looking for, I guess, a good, when choosing a caffeine product?
I suppose it's looking at the dose. So what are they doing and what they want the caffeine for, really. So most of the times, having a small dose of caffeine is probably going to be beneficial in terms of we don't want to go too crazy on one big hit. Yeah. So thinking about if you're just going to the gym, a little bit of caffeine is going to have a bit of a boost. Some of the research I looked at with some of the students, we found that having a belted pouch increased our muscle endurance by approximately 15% compared to a placebo gum, so something without any caffeine. And also we found a reduction in RPE, and that was with my previous study I spoke about doing soccer, but also in the gym environment when we were doing the repetitions to exhaustion. So yeah, a small dose can have a positive effect within the gym. That's probably going to translate a little bit as well to cognitive function, so for everyday life as well. So a lower dose is going to give you that nice sort of effect without having a larger dose, which potentially is going to or can potentially have more side effects with it.
Okay. So what's your take on fast acting caffeine formats like pouches, gum versus traditional coffee or energy drinks?
Yeah, I know. I think they're great. I think it's a great, it's just a great way of getting caffeine in. So thinking about, sometimes, like I said, with drinks and foods, you've got to take it sort of 45 minutes for it to sort of start when you want it to kick in. Sometimes you haven't got that luxury to so you want to have a little quick fix or way. So that would be a positive there in terms of, again, the speed of absorption, getting into the system a lot quicker, and maybe it's not as planned or your day is not as planned. It's a little bit more as and when you need it, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we got some audience questions we posted a story a couple of days ago asking for questions to ask live here. And so if any are repetitive, I'm sorry, we just got a list. So from Cynthia from New Hampshire, she wants to know if there's a difference between how men and women respond to caffeine. I believe we kind of covered that earlier, but.
Yeah, we touched on that. So it's interesting. There's probably a limited amount of research looking specifically at females. But there has been some review articles, and you're still finding positive effects, especially on muscle endurance and strength as well within females. So it is having a positive effect. It's not just something that men should go for. And like I said, there is research that shows that if you're on contraception, it can slow down the metabolism, so you might sort of stay in the system a little bit longer. So yeah, so caffeine will have positive effects for females, similar to the male counterparts.
Beautiful. So Matthew from Alabama wants to know, as we also covered a little bit earlier, was best time of day to take caffeine. Because I know we talked about myths around mornings, but
I suppose again it depends. It depends what you want it for, really. If it's for a pick me up, it's about whenever you're tired, have a bit of caffeine, I suppose. I'd avoid having it too late because you don't affect your sleep. Like we touched on as well. So maybe something like you said, maybe after 5 o'clock for some people, it might be best to avoid. But I think having it, like for me, my routine for work, I normally drive into work, and if I'm tired, I might have I'm belting a car. I'll take some if I'm stuck in traffic, or when I get straight to work, I like to have my coffee in the morning first thing. So for me, I don't think there's sort of a bad time to take it throughout the day. It's probably more in the evening. I'd be sort of more wary of having a lot of caffeine.
And for our last one, Olivia from Florida wants to know, is it true that caffeine stunts your growth or raises blood pressure?
I've never heard of anything about stunting your growth. I think if that
Actually,
was true, I think there'd be.
Kid. I think my parents it's like if you're not good during Christmas, like Santa won't come and bring gifts. I heard that a lot as a kid while drinking coffee. Oh, you won't grow to your certain height. So that's actually I'm also asking that question now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I've never heard about that one, and I think if that was a factor, then there'll be a lot more sports clubs and athletes that would be very wary of caffeine.
I needed to ask my mother about that after this because I got told all the time as a kid. That's so funny now that I'm reading that. Thank you, Olivia from Florida, because I never considered asking that. That's so interesting. So there's not true.
So. I've never come across that, if I'm honest, with the research I've read.
That's great.
Yeah, I think because caffeine is interesting. There's loads of sports supplements out there. So there's tens, hundreds, even maybe different types of supplements, and caffeine is one of those that has a lot of robust evidence behind it. The sort of that someone like the American College of Sport and Exercise, so the ACSM, so the American College of Sports Medicine, sort of suggests that it is worthwhile, and even things like the International Olympic Committee did a paper where caffeine was one of 5 supplements that they sort of suggest has enough evidence for us to sort of suggest that it is an ergogenic aid, or something that would improve performance.
And actually, one more question from me. So, when it comes to your students, and what are their insights, if any, when it comes to going through your research? Is there any comments from them?
So I use caffeine not only in my research but in my teaching as well. So I run a sport nutrition module, and what we do within the labs is we do a little experiment where I get students with caffeine versus a placebo, and we get them to do some repeated sprint activity. And we really get them to we work them hard.
I was a soccer player for a long time, so yeah, I'm used to this.
Yeah. So, we get a lot out of them, and then we sort of take some power measurements, we take some blood, we get their RPE, and then that sort of really sparks interest in terms of all about caffeine, really, in terms of the use of it. And I think again, same with a lot of people, they don't appreciate that everyone thinks that caffeine is just a big stimulant, and to a certain extent that is true, but it has a lot of other sort of actions within the body it can do. So we do a lot of that within the teaching, and then within the research, I get students sort of to come up with ideas, and I share my ideas, and we collaborate and sort of look at or try and conduct some research and some studies. So one we got going at the moment, something like I mentioned earlier about utilizing caffeine in a half-time period to see if we can sort of maintain our sprint ability throughout the second half. And then a lot more just around using caffeine with a battery of tests to see if we can sort of improve with different types of doses and things. So it's really interesting. And within our students, within our program, we get students then between the second and third years go off the different sort of placements. So we've got a lot of placements in the UK working with elite football or soccer and rugby teams, but we also got students in the States. So recently I was in College Station visiting one of my students in Texas A&M, and then another one in in Illinois, so Southern Illinois, University of Edwardsville. So they're working with athletes, and it's interesting talking to them about their sort of use of caffeine and things like that. So caffeine is one of those supplements or ergogenic aids that I think most people within sport and performance are aware of, and I've tried it or are using it to some capacity.
Okay, amazing. Well, any last comments you want to make on caffeine? Any last comments you want to make on Belter before we wrap up? Okay. For me, like I said, with the bit of research we've done with caffeine and Belter particularly, it sort of shows promise. So it does show that it can potentially be another sort of format of caffeine that can be effective. It's very portable as well, so it's easy to take around with us. The flavor is quite interesting as well, because one of the comments with the chewing gum is after a while of chewing, you get that bitterness, because caffeine ultimately is a bitter white powder. So you get that coming through, and you don't get that with the Belter, because you've got
all the flavor that sort of it retains.
Yeah, no, that's definitely our pride and joy is the flavor, which is great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and all. This has been super fun. And I hope while you continue research, we can have you back on and just continue to build this.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me, Maggie. Yep.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Bye now.
Awesome. Thanks so much for everyone. And we'll see you next time.